Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Avinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to welcome Jonathan Buckley live from a very late Brighton, here to discuss his novel, The Great Concert of the Night, in conversation with NYRB Classics editor Edwin Frank. We're especially happy to be continuing our series with our friends at NYRB Classics and to be able to reach all of you in the comforts of your homes. So to some housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have a question, please click on the Q&A button right here at the bottom of your screen to submit it. We'll try to get through as many of those as we can towards the end of the program. And there's also a chat button here at the bottom where I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, as well as a link to donate to anti-racist organizations if that's within your means. A caveat for tonight's program and for all of our virtual events: we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please do bear with any technical issues that could arise during the program. We'll try to solve them quickly. And finally, this series is going to take a break through August so Edwin and I can vacation and regroup a little bit, but we'll return this fall with a whole roster of events, including a program celebrating the NYRB reissues of William Gaddis's The Recognitions and JR. We're still in the planning stages of a lot of this, so please do sign up for our newsletter and you'll be able to stay up to date that way. So now a little about tonight's presenters, and we'll get started. Jonathan Buckley is the author of the novels Ghost Makindo, So He Takes the Dog, Nostalgia, and several others. He was the 2015 winner of the BBC National Short Story Award. He lives in Hove, England. And Edwin Frank is the founder and editor of the NYRB Classics series and the author of a book of poems, Snake Train. So Jonathan and Edwin, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you, Community Books, for continuing to sponsor these readings. And thank you, Jonathan, for joining us from England at a late hour, as Hal said. And thank you all the rest of you who are here for the event, which, as Hal said, Jonathan will read from, and we will talk about a bit his novel, not his latest novel. His latest novel has it come out in England already? Live, Live, Live?
Today is publication day.
Today is publication day. Congratulations. And we will publish it next year. So that's great.
Congrats.
The Great Concert of the Night is your, I was just saying, is your first novel, I think, published in the United States, right? But it's your 10th novel we just established, or was it? Yeah. It's great that finally something of yours has been published over here, and it's such a wonderful book. I'll describe it a little bit so that anybody who hasn't read it has a sense of the book. The Great Concert of the Night is, in the simplest sense, the story of David, who is, and this is a reductive account, who is the director of an ailing and indeed failing, as we discover, provincial museum in England called the Sanderson-Perceval Museum, and who has had an on-again, off-again, and one has a sense sometimes it was more off-again than not, relationship with a movie actress, who named Imogen, or Imogen, I suppose, one or the other, or both, because she's French and English, who has died in the prime of her life of uterine cancer, or ovarian cancer, I think. And it begins on New Year's Eve, and David is alone. Imogen has been dead for some months, and he basically begins to keep a journal in which he is trying to both exercise and exorcise his grief, and also try to sort of reconstruct the image of Imogen, and also just keep a journal to keep track of the days. And the book basically is a year of that journal, cum commonplace book, cum reckoning with his loss. That means it's a book that, in a way, is a book of a voice, not unlike books by people like Sebald and Javier Marias and Thomas Bernhardt, or for that matter, Italo Svevo's Confessions of Zeno, but a book of a voice, not unlike even in some ways Notes from Underground, of an unreliable narrator to a certain degree, but also a voice who commands our attention and has a certain literary self-consciousness. But it's interestingly at the same time a book of events, because the different things chronicled stretch back in time to the 19th century, with the to talk about the lives of the directors of the museum, stretch back into the lives of the parents of Imogen and the neighbors and a tenant who lives for a while in David's house. So that in another sense, this book of a voice is actually, and it's a slim and very effective and efficient book. Also somewhat like a 19th century novel, three-decker, with these different plots interwoven and a whole view of society and even history to some degree opening out of it. So it's an unusual and beguiling and also finally very moving accomplishment. And why don't you read a bit from the book, and then we can talk about it a bit more.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you. I thought what I'd read is to give some notion of the way the book proceeds. 4 very brief sections, which are not contiguous. They're the first 3 are from the early part of the book, and there's one from the later part of the book. And there's some sort of thematic connection between all 4. I'll get straight in. Asked if she could remember when she'd realised that she would become an actress, Imogen would sometimes answer that her career could be traced to a story that a school friend had told her about an elderly man from Czechoslovakia. This friend's family had moved to London when she was 12 years old, and she and her brother had soon come to know Mr. Dobrý. Near their new house, there was a small park, and Mr. Dobrý could be seen there almost every afternoon, feeding the birds and the squirrels. He was an old man, but smartly dressed always, with a white scarf round his neck on all but the warmest days, and a black 3-piece suit that was never unbuttoned. In winter, he wore a thick black coat that gleamed. Mr. Dobrý had a hat that made him look like a character from a black and white film, Imogen's friend had said. His walking stick had a lion's head for a handle in real silver. His hair was white and cut in an old-fashioned way. He had a lovely white moustache. Local shopkeepers knew a few things about this refined old gentleman, but not much. He had come to England from Czechoslovakia a couple of years before the war with a wife who was no longer living. Mr. Dobrý's hometown was a place called Karlovy Vary, where he had worked in a hotel that was owned by his family. It was an expensive hotel. His parents had remained in Karlovy Vary, but his sister was believed to have emigrated with him. It was not known what had become of her. The inference was that she, like the parents and the wife, had died. Nobody was ever seen with Mr. Dobrý. He did not seem unhappy, however, and he had money, as one could tell from his clothes. Someone had heard that Mr. Dobrý owned a hotel in London. It was not known where Mr. Dobrý lived. Not far from here, he told anyone who asked. He would let the children help him to feed the animals, but there was nothing creepy about Mr. Dobrý, Imogen's friend insisted. The parents all liked him. He was friendly to everyone, and he had wonderful tales about his life in Czechoslovakia. Sometimes he would show the children photographs of hotels that looked like castles, of churches with shining domes that were onion-shaped, of ladies with parasols standing in front of colonnades and fountains. The photographs were the colour of tea. He brought coins and letters and postcards that were covered with unreadable handwriting. In the Dobrý family's hotel, there was a piano on which Chopin had played. He explained how famous Chopin was and showed them a picture of the piano, which stood between palm trees in a room with a glass ceiling. Mr. Dobrý would point to the faces in the photographs and recite all the names. Though he'd left Czechoslovakia so many years before, his accent was strong. Then came a month when Mr. Dobrý was missing from the park. Nobody knew where he had gone. Occasionally he'd been absent for a week or 2. He never gave warning of his departure and never said where he had been when he returned. He'd never been missing for a whole month. The absence continued until one evening the friend's father announced that Mr. Dobrý had died. The story was in the newspaper. It turned out that Mr. Dobrý had lived in a tiny flat at the end of a bus route that passed the park. A birth certificate had been found and a sister traced. Her name was Edith, and she'd been born in Sheffield. as had Mr. Dobry, whose name in fact was Kenneth Tate. Edith had not seen or heard from her brother for 40 years. She had not known where he'd been living and knew nothing about his life. The newspaper carried an appeal for information, but nobody ever came forward to say they'd known Mr. Dobry under this or any other name. How wonderful to have been Mr. Dobry, Imogen had thought when her friend told her the story. To have invented such a life and to have lived it out seemed an enterprise of genius. This next section refers to one of the films that Imogen appears in. The final scene of Maintenant est à l'heure de notre mort is difficult to watch. It is difficult for anyone to watch. The woman, Marguerite, is in her bedroom, seated in front of a mirror. Motionless, the camera observes her from the far side of the room. The distance implies some sort of tact. A window is open. We hear a car passing in the street. After 10 seconds, a second car. A child calls out and is answered by another child. The room is bright with sunlight. Calmly, or so it seems, the woman regards the reflection of her face. We hear her exhale, then the camera is abruptly in the place of the mirror and her face occupies most of the screen. The lens receives Margaret's consideration. We last saw her weeping. She is not weeping now. Her eyes suggest exhaustion and vast disappointment. Then, in the space of 2 or 3 seconds, the focus of her gaze changes. The eyes widen fractionally. The exhaustion appears to dissipate. Marguerite is no longer looking at what she sees in the glass. She's looking through the glass at us. Her gaze makes each of us feel that we are being specifically addressed. Look at me, says her gaze. Nothing in her face undergoes any alteration. Her mouth is relaxed and closed. There is no frown. She blinks slowly with composure. That is the only movement. She's not protesting, neither is she requesting pity. The power of her gaze is the power of absolute openness. For a full minute, we are not released. Each of us must look at her. We must look into her eyes and return the gaze of this dying woman until, in an instant, the screen becomes black. In the book of Marjorie Kemp, which has a claim to be the earliest English autobiography, the author records her visions of Christ and the words he spoke to her. He gave her several orders. One such order was a command to take the Eucharist every Sunday. This she did. It seems that her extravagant piety was regarded with some suspicion by the townspeople of Bishop's Lynn, as were her outbursts of devotional wailing and writhing. For most people in England at this time, communion was an annual devotion undertaken at Easter. At other times, the host was something to be seen, not consumed. The monstrance, the instrument of display, was of paramount importance to the cult of Eucharistic piety. Spiritual communion was achieved by means of sight. And finally, the fourth section. Imogen discovered, in a box of miscellaneous old photographs, a small picture of a young woman sitting at the library table on which a chessboard has been set. From the young woman's dress and certain details of the room, it seemed that the picture dated from around 1920. She was smiling, apparently at something that was happening to her left. Her expression suggested an attractive and clever character. Most of the chess pieces had been removed from the board. Imogen liked to think that a male opponent had just conceded defeat. The fairness of the young woman's hair, the clarity of her eyes, gave young Imogen the idea that she was German. Matilda, she named her, because neither her mother nor her father had any idea who the young woman might really have been. Nobody knew who she was. For some time, this was wonderful. Matilda was a woman of mystery. Her name was Matilda, in the way that a painting of a beautiful unknown woman might be given a name. Flora, Venus, the veiled woman. When she was sent to school, Imogen took the photograph of Matilda with her. The meaning of the image began to change. Matilda had been brilliant and beautiful. She visited the house and sat at the table at which Imogen had so often sat. Now nobody at home knew anything about her. Somewhere her body was lying in the earth. Her gravestone was perhaps no longer meaningful to anybody. Only this image remained, an image to which any woman's name could be attached.
Thank you. It's interesting. I love the story of Mr. Dobry, and Well, let's talk first about all of these passages are, of course, David writing. And so David, as I said, is sort of the voice of the book, and he is indeed in the book, the writer of the book. And he is erudite in various ways, and as in the section you read from Marjorie Kemp, about Marjorie Kemp, which also, of course, connects with the interest in sight and image that are important to the book too. So we'll have to, and religion, but he's also, we begin to see, or really we see almost at the beginning, David is also a character in the book, and he's a bit of a character. And the kind of, and a bit of a stick in mud and so on, and he's surrounded by, this doesn't come out here, that there are a bunch of other characters in the book too, his sister, his ex-wife, who are all quite impatient with him. So it must have been an interesting job to balance both your character as a figure in the book and as your mouthpiece in another way too. How did you go?
Yeah. Sorry, Edwin. He is my mouthpiece to an extent. It's of course very difficult for me to see him as a reader sees him. I'm interested you say that he's a bit of a character. I find him a bit wearisome a lot of the time, and the women around him whom you mention, who are impatient with him, are generally right. There's one in particular who annoys him, who is the woman with whom his ex-wife now lives.
Yeah.
Who is sort of the main butt of his irony, I think.
Yeah.
She speaks in a sort of, or rather she discourses in a register that he finds extremely unsympathetic and derivative and banal. But crucially, she's right about him, I think.
Yeah.
She sees things that he doesn't, like, for example, it's perhaps inevitable with any British novel, class is there.
Yeah.
And part of the allure of Imogen is this allure that the upper classes have, sadly, for many Brits. And Val, this woman, she can see that. She can see that he's, to an extent, enthralled to the glamour of the sort of the lower gentry from which Imogen proceeds. Mm-hmm. As for the way he assembles the book, I suppose, should we talk about the sort of disjointed nature of narrative? Is that something we should discuss? That
I mean, this is disjointed, but also we woven together, sort of.
I would hope so. Yes, but I have this. I've had a great affinity with Galen Strawson. I believe you published, don't you? Yeah. So one of his central topics is the philosophy of self and how self coheres over time, and whether or not we exist as sort of as narrative beings. And I don't. I have no sense of my life as a continuous narrative. Mm-hmm. And Strawson takes great exception to what he takes to be this prevalent notion that a life is a fully achieved life is necessarily something that one perceives as a narrative construct with yourself as the protagonist of it. That a life is successful, a life is replete to the extent that one lives it as if one were a novelist almost. I think he quotes, it's Daniel Dennett, isn't he? I think he's always arguing with. Daniel Dennett says, we are all virtuoso novelists. We all perceive our lives as if they were novels. I think this is fundamentally untrue. Mm-hmm. And I think for David too, he's contiguous, or he's congruent with me to that extent, that mm-hmm. he too is an anti-narrativist. I mean, Strawson divides people and writers in particular into diachronic stroke narrativists and episodics. Mm-hmm. And I'm definitely in the latter camp, as I think is David. Mm-hmm. And of course, his subject is partly himself, and it's partly a woman who really resists being turned into any sort of cohesive narrative protagonist. I mean, what she does for a living is fragment herself and reimagine herself as a succession of different people. Sorry.
He's sort of tormented by, I mean, because it comes clear as the book goes on that he's not only in torment because of her death, but indeed the relationship was in various ways tormented because he wanted to impose kinds of order on it that she resists. She certainly didn't want to, it's clear she had no wish to settle down with him particularly. And indeed at some point, he quotes her as saying the one thing she was completely secure in knowing was that there was no secure identity behind Imogen. She also is, and I mean, the site, well, if you are skeptical about narrative or story, and there's some point late in the book where David says, not story, he and perhaps you are fascinated by image. She's very much a film, she only works in film, there's a point to make. And like an image, she appears in some sense to disappear. She's as opaque as she is suddenly revealed and so on. That must, and her name, by the way, contains image, it suddenly struck me at a certain point too. But that would have been interesting to write a character who's at once supremely alluring and also utterly not there in a curious way, which is what
Did you find her alluring?
Well, she is presented as being supremely alluring. Right. She can also be seen as quite manipulative too. And so, I mean, she's left opaque, and he's tormented by that opacity in a way.
Yeah, and it's perhaps a question raised by the book to what extent she also is tormented by her own, some of the experiences to which she subjects herself. Could be seen partly as attempts at sort of self-transcendence or self-discovery, or alternatively as self-annihilation. It's never quite clear whether she can be described as in any way a contented, a happy, a settled entity.
Yeah.
But yeah, the point you're making about her, the importance of the visual, that she is a film actress. It's debatable whether she's a good actress, but she quite clearly has. I think at one point she does actually explain why she doesn't like theatre, and that sort of overlaps to an extent with Robert Bresson, who crops up in the book. I think he's actually at one point she talks about what her favourite film is and why it's her favourite film. And it's a Bresson film, which she likes really because there's less acting in it than there is in any of the films that she herself has made. And that again sort of links with the whole the idea of authenticity. To what extent it makes sense to talk about anybody having an authentic self, what that authentic self might be, how one might find it. How important is authenticity? How important is sincerity? I mean, does it matter that Imogen is sort of a succession of performances?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's Mouchette that she most admires, and I think I think
how Balthazar. I think she likes because.
Oh, I'm sorry, not Mouchette. Oh, yes, I get it. But she particularly likes the donkey at the end, who's shot for real, right? And in that sense, it's supposed to suggest her rather ruthless and calculating side, or pitiless side.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And she likes the donkey doesn't realise it's in a film. I think she says,
and is also literally killed too. So well, so the other thing, I mean, when I said David's a bit of a character, I mean, I could have also said he's a bit of a stick in the mud. He's both very erudite, but he also is, I mean, in the eyes of Val, who I think is a life coach or something like that, hence his ability.
That's how she described herself.
And also a big success too. Let's talk about another character in the book, which is a very unusual character, to have in any book. It's the museum. I can never get it right. Sanderson-Perceval or Perceval Sanderson. Yeah. How did you? I was recently. It reminds me of it's a bit of a cabinet of wonders, but I was recently in when one could still travel at the beginning of the year in Germany, and I went to a provincial museum in Oldenburg, which was nothing but pieces of furniture that nobody would ever wish to have, and paintings that were completely bad copies of Baroque paintings. And the one good painting was, of course, by a Nazi. And that, but it's not quite the museum, but your museum is a great museum, is a wonderful museum. What brought you to that?
I've done museums, but another one of my books has a fictional museum in it. In Nostalgia, I have a fictional Italian village with fictional buildings and a museum that is full of a similar miscellany of artifacts, a couple of which are genuine, but the majority of which are invented. And yeah, that's, like you say, Deb is a bit of a stick in the mud. And I think that the image of the museum is in a way a sort of, it's a parallel to the novel itself, is that what David is, he's, as it were, reconstructing stroke replacing Imogen with a sort of a collage and an assemblage of memories stroke imagined scenes. And that sort of, that idea of a constellation of images is, I think, what he finds stimulating in the museum. However banal a lot of the artifacts might be, however uninteresting they might be, when put together, they work off each other, and any object placed in a museum does acquire a certain aura by virtue of it being something that one is obliged to actually look at for any length of time. But on the other hand, you could see it as being, it's demonstrating, David's crippling adherence to the fossilized and the extinct.
Yeah. Well, he's fascinated by relics, and of course he returns to
absolutely
and movies again and again and again. He doesn't much like them, partly because he doesn't like the fact that she is naked and engaged in sex acts in them, and he's jealous. But it's unclear how real these acts are. But the theme of relics is crucial, and along with the theme of vision, and again, you have all sorts of interesting disquisitions on David's part about relics and religious observances. There is, well, I mean, let's talk about the religious dimension of his obsession with a woman whose career is very profane in a way.
Yeah, but a woman, yes, whose career is profane, but at the same time, I think the one person of whom she expresses great admiration is Simone Weil, who is somebody who as unlike Imogen as it's possible to be. And there is this sort of woven through the book, as you say, there's the motif of relics, the Catholicism, right? I mean, I'm not in any sense Catholic. I spent a long time in Italy, which perhaps is a consideration. But say Catholicism runs through the book, the idea of Catholicism as being that strand of Christianity in which the visual is of paramount importance, and of course the cult of relics. And the appeal of the miscellaneous, and various, like the idea of charity and love that runs through the book. Again, that Simone Weil's ideas about love underpin a lot of what David writes, a lot of what Imogen says to him, and things like the idea of the good death, like in Philippe Arrier's great book. So to an extent you could say that Imogen is somebody who is nothing but a succession of roles until it comes to the terminus, right, where she perhaps finally achieves absolute authenticity by dying a good death. But to what extent that is another role that she has assumed,
is
is
left.
is questionable, yes, but it is undeniably, I think, a good death.
I wanted to ask about I mean, throughout the book, you weave accounts of the different films, just enough so that we have a sense of the whole of the movie, but not quite what it really is about.
Yeah.
That must be, and you also write about, as you read the section about writing about the image. So there's a lot of writing about other works of art throughout.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. That's something I have a tendency to do. But yeah, so the films, they are, again, I don't know whether Sperry's reviews have said these are not films I'd ever want to see. I'm not sure I would, but they are clearly.
Did I say that? I didn't say that.
No, you didn't, but other people have.
Oh,
but they are sort of, there are elements of, say, of Bresson, and some of the films sound like they could have been dreamt up by Valerian Borovchik. Others sound more like sort of Gallic Peter Greenaway concoctions, that kind of thing. But sorry,
it's really fun to make them up and to think about them, and I mean, and they do teeter. I mean, it's, your book is often very funny, and both between the characters, between Val and so it's a very somber book, but it's also quite a funny book. And these, and especially when you walk on a knife edge. You have the French director who gets involved in a Me Too business thing, a sort of Me Too thing, but who delivers himself of, I mean, because Imogen, I should say, works mainly in French art films. But
and that particular director has a corresponds quite closely to a French director I shall not name, who was indeed, I think, hauled in front of the judge for what he wanted the judge to think were his rather unorthodox auditioning procedures. I'll send you privately the name at some point. But yes, but that was quite. I enjoyed. I came up with about a dozen fictional films and then elaborated them and then pared them away to the point where I think you were left, I hope, with enough fragments to get some idea of how they might look and where they might be going.
Yeah, it goes on that. Going back to Galen book, I mean, there's another, again, one of the serious strands of the book, which is serious, but as by contrast, false contrast to humorous, concerns the relationship between body and person and perhaps something like soul. And there are moments where David seems to want to go to, Galen, of course, believes that matter is consciousness is a function of matter.
We get to yes, exactly, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's not.
I must say, I can't follow him there.
You can't follow him there.
No, I don't. But his idea of
you want to follow him there.
No, the thin self, I think is an idea I feel a great affinity with. But when you pursue that idea to its logical conclusion as he does, you end up thinking, how the hell did I get here? This can't be right. And I think if I had Galen Strawson's mind and his clarity of thought, perhaps I wouldn't be writing novels. I don't know the answer. I have no idea how one. I have a sort of vague sense of the cohesion of the self. I don't have any sense of my life as a story. And when I look back at photographs, look back at things I've read, when I look back at my books, I don't really recognize the text much anymore. I can't put myself back into the thoughts from which that text proceeded. I mean, I definitely see my life as a sequence of episodes. Yes, I'm sorry, I led you off there from talking about Galen.
That's fine. I was thinking what you led to is actually, I was thinking of this passage in the book where I think it's Imogen who suddenly sees imagines herself having a thought, which is a spark in her mind, which she is seeing as a spark in her mind.
Absolutely.
And kind of you know, it's not a story, but it's a series of it's an almost endless removal from the self, which is in fact what the self is, she almost seems to be saying.
Absolutely, and there is no terminus to it. Every time you think, you never work out what it is that's examining the thoughts you've just had.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the body, yes, and Imogen's relationship to the body, which again leads back into the Catholic strand, that there is a sort of, there is perhaps an element of, there are points at which David seems to be seeing her as some sort of profane saint, I think. And her, as I say, that Imogen's sexuality and some of the things she does on film and not on film that cause him great distress are in some ways sort of perhaps to be aligned with the thoughts of people like Georges Bataille. They are, perhaps, the self-transcendence through, the sort of the most extreme indulgence in sensory experience. But then again, it is odd to say that she keeps coming back to Simone Weil, which in turn dovetails with the whole, the subject of relics. That because Simone Weil's great experience when she found herself praying for the first time in her life took place in Assisi, but not in the great basilica in Assisi, but in the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, which is, if you've been there to,
when I was a child, when I was a
right,
teenager. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's a very peculiar building in the sense that the church is itself a reliquary, and the relic that it enshrines is St. Francis's church. So you go into this rather sort of humdrum, large Baroque pilgrimage church, and where the altar should be is another church. And it's this rough study, the portiuncula that Francis and the first Franciscans built, and they built the pilgrimage church to enshrine it. And I just thought it's very, very interesting that Simone Weil should have had this extraordinary experience about which she was always rather she was rather unspecific about what had occasioned it. We just know where it happened, but that it should have happened in that particular spot where you've got the shrine of the church itself is a relic within the big church. And then there's another smaller relic off to the side where you can see the place at which Francis died. The spot is like a little chapel within the church. Mm-hmm. So that, it comes back to the whole idea of relic, why relics are important, why one needs, the bodily trace, as it were, the physical trace.
Right. Well, and the book, of course, is full of, your book nests different kinds of stories within different kinds of stories, both, and actually, ultimately, as I said at the beginning, does rather weave them together to a story of, in some sense, David finally creates a reliquary for Imogen, but also, in some sense, really does exorcise her at the same time, it seems, by the end. There is a way in which he is getting her out of his system throughout this book.
Yeah, I think so. And he's created a version of her which isn't really in any sense, he hasn't retrieved her, he hasn't resurrected her, he's constructed this entity that corresponds to her in certain respects, but which he knows isn't her. Just as she eluded him, then she will necessarily elude any text. But just something you said there, was just thing I just wanted to refer to, if we've got a minute, on the subject of structure, which is my liking for sort of text composed in sort of mosaic form. It's something I've always resisted is books that conclude, or books that have this sort of, I can't think who said it, but the thing, the teleological imperative, the idea that running through the book, there is the destination and the book is going to get you there. That's something I've never been terribly interested in. And I think music is quite important as a sort of, as a, not in the sense that, you know, the themes, the motifs are interwoven in a fugal way or whatever, to an extent they are, but I've always found late 20th century music, or some early 20th century music, formally more interesting than a lot of novels, in the sense of I've never quite understood why it isn't possible, or why people resist the idea that a book can be something that you inhabit for a certain period of time and then take your leave of without actually having arrived at a destination or a conclusion of any sort. So something I always refer to, the music of Morton Feldman is something that I like very, very much, particularly the expansive later material where, you know, the examination, the sort of modulation material goes on for so long that memory is no longer working. You can't really remember where you were an hour ago, and you have no sense of where you're going. And that is something that, you know, I'd like one day to, you know, to compose a book that one inhabits when you allow it to strand you for a while and then you just leave it. I mean, I'm sure it will aggravate a lot of people immensely, but as a sort of formal correlative, that's something I just wanted to bring up.
Well, it's interesting. This is a book full of descriptions, as I said before, already many of them extremely engaging, of other artworks, of bits of film, of also strange, you know, medical displays and so on. But the one kind of artwork that I don't think is described at any point or alluded to by David at any point is a novel, and yet it's very much a book about the about what novels can do, and in some sense the life and death difference. That, I mean, not particularly, you know, that patching your life into a trim little story quite is, but the need to reflect on your life or compose an image of the life in order to understand the life, which is very much, I think, part of this book.
Yeah. But again, it's questionable to what extent he's actually arrived at any real knowledge of himself. I think Val understands him better than he understands himself, and like you say, he has inadvertently written a novel while failing to write the book that in the book he's intending to write, which Val knows he will never actually get round to writing.
Right. That's right. He's supposed to be writing a study of something or other, right?
Well, I think he intends to write a book about the family whose bequest forms the backbone of the museum, of which he's the curator. Yeah, a family in whom he's interested, again, perhaps because they were that strange anomalous sort of a medical family, or one particular medic who converted to Catholicism at great personal expense, it turned out. But yes, so he never writes what he intends to write. Yeah.
Right, which of course may be the fate of a novelist.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, why don't we turn it over to questions at this point, since we...
All right, we do have some good questions here. I'm just going to go down from the top. Were there any organizational principles that you used to keep the narrative moving forward?
There's no organizational principle. But there are various strands of which I was aware, and I knew into what categories these strands fitted, and I was aware that after so many thousand words, another strand needed to be introduced. But there was no principle. Unlike the book I referred to earlier, Nostalgia, very much does have an organizational principle, which is written on a grid of 12 by 12. The principle might not be readily apparent, but I'd hope you'd know there was some kind of principle at work. But in this one, no, and it went through multiple reworkings and abbreviations in order to achieve the form I wanted. But no, there's no overriding principle other than that of the journal.
Sure. All right. The sustained, measured quality of the narrator's voice was so carefully rendered. What were the difficulties in maintaining that voice in the process of writing across an entire novel?
Um, I suspect that I think as Edwin said right at the start, it might actually be quite close to my own voice at times. But again, it's just, I come back to multiple drafts. I think the version that was published, I can glance at my machine and I can tell you that there are 9 previous iterations of the book, each longer than the final one. So
That's always a good trend.
My revisions always get smaller, and I always read them aloud again and again and again. And I would hope that any tonal incongruities get picked up in that way.
All right. This is sort of picking up on that last question. You say that the narrator you find wearisome. I find that this funny, this person says. Did you set out planning to investigate a person who essentially tires you and other people around them, or did that evolve as you wrote in the voice?
I think at the outset, I had him as somebody who would test one's patience. I'm not sure I'd want to spend an evening with him, but he's a kind of character that I've done before. He's a sort of cousin of the protagonist of my third novel called Ghost McKindo, who's a person who we follow year by year. There's one chapter for each year of his life, beginning with his first memory. And he's somebody who basically never gets round to forming a clear idea of who he is. And it's an immensely episodic life. And I found that some people find him utterly unbearably exasperating, and others think he's an almost saintly individual. But I seem to have sort of a weakness for passive, slightly ineffectual men.
If you keep a journal, how would it, or how does it, or would it differ from this novel?
I've never ever kept a journal at all. I think because I don't know.
I've got 4 entries from 2006.
Right. Okay. Now, I think the last time I kept a diary was when I was 10 years old. I think that I can't recall why I did that. I'm not really sure I have any thoughts I think are interesting enough to make note of. I think any interesting ideas, I sound rather presumptuous, but they proceed from the book, as it were. You know, once you've thought of who these speakers might be and how they might interact, then they tend to spark off each other. And I hope some of the things they say are of interest. And I'm aware that some of David's observations are less interesting than others. I wanted there to be certain longueurs in the book. It is, after all, a book that he compels himself to write. The exercise of writing something daily necessarily means there are days on which he really hasn't got anything particularly fascinating to say, and he knows it. So that's a long-winded answer to the question. I don't know. I've never done it, and I can't imagine I'd have any inclination to do so. That perhaps I will bitterly regret it in a few years' time.
Our next question, the classic quarantine question. If you're writing now, how has all of this affected your process?
It's only affected my process insofar as our son is living with us again, and that makes the day rather different. But it doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. I mean, I think I tend to spend all day here or on my bike. So this is why I'm the last person in Britain, I think, not to have a mobile phone. I'm just not mobile. I'm always. I've been in quarantine for the last 35 years, I think.
David, of course, also deplores the phones and everybody. I mean, it's this, again, it's one of the comic streaks. He's furious at all the people staring at their phones all the time.
Yeah.
In other sense, he's staring at the images on the TV screen all the time too.
Exactly. Yeah. That is one aspect in which I don't exactly overlap with David. As my son spends a lot of time staring at his phone, I can see the immense value of it. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, I basically, quarantine has made very, very little difference to me, I'm afraid.
This is kind of an interesting theoretical question. You say that Catholicism informs the kind of aesthetic focus of the book.
Right.
What would this novel look like under a Protestant worldview? If you want to answer this one. This is a little bit of a creative answer, I think.
It wouldn't exist, I think. It wouldn't exist. Well, as I temperamentally, I tend to favour the Catholic wing over the Protestant, in the same way that, without being in any way religious myself, but it's a sort of affinity akin to like Pasolini or Roberto Rossellini's affinity with you. They were both atheists, but both made films that were, favourably disposed towards certain elements of the Catholic worldview. I can't imagine how the sort of the emphasis, certainly on relics, wouldn't at all accord with a Protestant worldview. The emphasis on the visual, and probably the sex.
Mm-hmm.
I know there is such a thing as Protestant sex, but it would be an entirely different kind of thing.
It'd be a real short book, and they would have stolen all the relics.
Absolutely, yeah.
What movies were you watching when you wrote the novel, if you can recall?
Oh, well, that's difficult to recall, because I do watch a lot of movies that again, my adherence to outmoded technology, I watch stuff on DVD, and every week we watch 3 films, at least 3 films, and it's difficult to recall what I was watching in the course of the best part of 2 years that over which the book took shape. But the films that underpin the book would certainly be Bresson, Albert Serra to a certain extent. There will be elements of Eric Romer in there, and the director who I'm not going to name because he ended up in court.
I thought I could get you. And here we have our last question.
Okay.
This is more of a request. Can you talk a little bit more about Live, Live, Live?
Live, Live, Live is, again, another sort of episodic kind of book in which the person who is compiling the text is the neighbor of somebody who is a medium. The narrator is interested in this man, partly because he's so obviously a fraud, partly because he so obviously is of great help to people, and partly because he lives with a very attractive young woman whose presence in that household is something of a mystery. And again, to an extent, like The Concert, it's a book about that young woman. It's an attempt to sort of, to preserve her, to preserve what he imagines is his relationship with her. But say that the central character is a man called Lucas Judd, who is a man who, as I say, is possibly a benevolent fraud.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer the question sufficiently?
As much as you want to give us.
Okay.
Well, thank you guys so much, Jonathan and Edwin, as always. And Jonathan, thank you for staying up so late with us. And
my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, Hal. Thank everybody.
Yeah, this is amazing. And just a reminder to everybody, you can purchase a copy of the book at communitybookstore.net. There's a link in the chat if you want to check that out. That will disappear in just a moment. But if you head over to our website, you can buy it there. Otherwise, as a reminder too, we'll be picking back up this series in September with a lot of great events. So just keep up to date with us. And otherwise, Edwin, Jonathan, have a great night. Everyone out there, stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody.
Goodbye.